getting to
It's coming through now. The microphone, is it?
Yeah,
okay, yep, can hear you. Can hear you now. Cool. We should get that up. Ready.
Yes.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm Paul Gardner-Stephen, as you probably guessed. I'm with the Serval project, and we talk about what we've been doing with what we're calling the Serval backbone, which is really a derivative of what Steve and his group have been doing with Village Telco. But before we go any further, we'll just start with a brief educational video that will be very helpful.
Goody, goody, yum, yum.
There was actually a point to that, of course, which I guess is in the wireless community network space. I think we are kind of the goodies. We're out there looking to help people out in a variety of ways, and in particular with the Serval project, we have this theme of telecommunications anywhere, anytime. And like the goodies, I think we're probably a little bit crazy for trying to do that, but I think there's a parallel. First, a little background about myself. I actually completely forgot about this until yesterday when I was sitting down, but this is actually the second time I've been engaged in wireless community networks. When I first got married, we bought this nice house here in the middle, which had an old brick garage at the back, which became my data centre, complete with rack and 3 Class C's 5P address space on a small DSL link. At the time when it was quite expensive to get DSL, and we've actually got 23 direct neighbours around that block. Without crossing a street. So without getting a telecommunications carrier license, we actually had enough people to put a few the blue Cat 5 links out, and then a very small mesh of 3 nodes, 802.11b using some early DWL access points. And that quite happily ran for sort of 7 or 8 years until we moved a year ago, and everyone was quite happy because they were getting internet for about 20 Australian dollars a month. Without having to, but actually one of them didn't even have a fixed line phone at the end, so they were saving themselves probably $50 a month. So it worked quite well, and I guess it's just yet another example of what the technology can do. But the Serval project itself was actually, it's the Haiti earthquake that set me thinking about what can we do for communications in those sort of situations. And Haiti was quite heavily reported that there was almost this perfect storm of infrastructure destruction. So communications was out right from the outset and wasn't restored in any real sense for about 2 days, and wasn't widely available for the first week or so to most people. And part of the difficulty in that was in fact that the airport was out, except I think there was one runway that they managed to get operating again, but the air traffic control was out. So there was actually, I think there were some planes that nearly crashed into one another trying to deliver aid, so then they had to kind of really control the airspace remotely, which added further delays into the process. The roads were quite messed up, and even the ports were actually messed up, which is a little bit unusual in these situations. You think normally that you can get boatloads of aid in, which of course gets you massive volume, even if there's a latency for a few days to get it in. So there was this kind of perfect storm. Then, I'm not sure how widely it was reported outside of Australia, but we had some quite bad bushfires a year or so ago that I think killed about 150 people, and the speed of the bushfires was actually quite tremendous because the temperatures were up in the 40 degrees kind of range with wind speeds of I think 60 to 100 kilometres an hour, and there was a lot of dry material around, and it basically went through rural Victoria with a fire front speed of between 100 and 160 kilometres an hour, and temperatures of about 400 to 500 degrees centigrade from ground level and below to about 80 or 90 feet up in the air. So even people who had dwellings that were officially bushfire proof, the entire structures collapsed because basically their houses were blast furnace to pieces. So and communications was a huge problem there because all the mobile phone towers got knocked out, and there were some great difficulties in our country fire authority there in Victoria organising themselves, or rather failing to organise themselves, and there's some systemic problems there, but communications played a huge problem. And so the usual communications channels to try and warn people, kind of in Australia we have the stay or flee kind of thing. There's a critical point at which you decide whether you're going to defend your home and whether you can see out the bushfire, or whether you actually basically hop in your car and drive away as quickly as you can, hopefully before the smoke means that you have zero visibility and people praying into each other on the road. So it's quite a nasty disaster situation as well. And then going further back, we have things like the tsunami on Boxing Day a few years ago now. But when Haiti started me thinking about this, and I started thinking about what are the critical aspects involved in this. And with Haiti, it was really this human factor that people want to be able to contact one another. If we were in a disaster now, we would want to make sure that our family knew that we were fine, and we'd want to make sure that our families were fine. And once you know that, or indeed, if they're dead, you can start grieving about it, but at least you can probably move on to start helping other people. But while you're concerned about your inner circle of loved ones, you're actually going to be quite paralysed from being able to help out. So there's the sense in which you want to use the communications infrastructure, which is A, not there, and B, if it is there, everyone is telling you, you need to leave it free for emergency services, because traditional infrastructure has, these single points of failure, and of course there's the strain and the load. And spectrally, things like GSM in this sort of situation are actually very inefficient, because you're having to use a bandwidth over a massive geographical area to place a call to someone 15 feet away. Whereas with a mesh network, if we're making calls in this room, really the spectrum doesn't leak much out of the building. So it's much more efficient. So we started thinking about this whole kind of process and what we could do to improve that. So the process actually started out in my mind of thinking about, okay, let's try and airdrop GSM base stations into disaster zones and get everything back up and running. So sort of dropping half-shipping container things out of the back of a C-130 Hercules. And then we found out about OpenBTS, but now we can drop backpack-sized things out of the back. And then a little bit more hunting around and finding out about what Village Telco was doing, and thinking about that process, we thought, okay, better yet, we can actually do this with much, much more compact devices. And ideally, in fact, you can have the technology in everyone's mobile phone. So if your phone has Wi-Fi, there's actually no additional hardware cost, it's purely a software thing. And we're hoping we'll get some traction with some handset vendors in that space. But one of the key things that I realised, whether you drop in a new network, or whether whether it's GSM infrastructure or new phones, you've got this problem. People in the disaster zone want to call one another. They know each other's existing phone numbers, but I think in Haiti actually their telecommunications data centre was largely offline, so it would have been very difficult to even try and find out people's IEMI to telephone number mappings and all of that kind of thing. It will take hours and days. Meanwhile, people are trapped under rubble, and more people are dying unnecessarily. So whatever the solution is, it has to be able to offer immediate claiming of an existing phone number, and not through some central authority, because again, then you have a point of failure. So that's kind of what we've been thinking about. So we came up with our distributed numbering architecture, which I'll talk more about, that does exactly that. You can just immediately claim your phone number and start using it. And Wi-Fi is our first step for unlicensed spectrum telephony, but I think there's a whole variety of interesting options that can be explored, whether it's ISM 915, given that it sits between the up and down links for GSM 850 and 900. So there's a radio in every phone that's actually primed for that and can transmit a nice power, and the power allowances are 10 dB higher than on 2.4 gigahertz in most jurisdictions. But of course, 915 isn't available in every country, so I think any solution will ultimately be a combination. So the other main use case that we're thinking about, and I think it's actually the one that I care even more about, the disaster one, but actually going back to the disaster one for a moment, disaster relief, I think, is the application that will get political traction in terms of hoping to see some regulatory reform. As we go through our technology roadmap, if we start making backpack-size OpenBTS-based units that could be airdropped into a disaster, then when the next disaster occurs and you say, okay, we want to deploy these, and you get told, oh no, you can't because of spectrum licensing issues, that actually provides enormous leverage. And I wouldn't hesitate to put it out in the media so that you can say, look, Serval project was prevented from doing this because of backward-thinking telecommunications regulations, and there's no provision for flexibility. I think that's what will start getting, hopefully, politicians and population engaging with the issue. But back to the remote and developing situation, I think this is very much the heart of where Village Telco is interested as well, and so we have a great deal in common in that space. So Australia is effectively a first and third world nation simultaneously. You've got this lovely pie crust of first worldness around the edge and a few kind of regional centres. But we are a nation of 21 million people on 9 million square kilometres of land, where about 19 or 20 million of those people live on that pie crust, and you have, say, 7 million square kilometres with under 1 million people living in that space. And many Aboriginal communities, as is sadly the case in many places around the world, lag behind in health and access to telecommunications and all of these things that really lead to quality of life in the long run. And even in Australia, because of the vast distances, and I think the US has this issue to some degree, some of the rural communities, you might have a town of 200 people and it's simply not feasible to put a GSM base station in there, unless it happens to be a tourist hub. And even then, why should people in a small county paying about 60 cents a minute to $1 a minute for mobile phone calls in Australia? So we have, in many ways, Australia is actually a very good test bed for these same things that happen around the world. SMS messages in Australia are still about 25 cents a piece, which is quite obscene. So there's a whole pile of ways that you can approach mesh telephony. And we've really approached it from, well, actually, more than mesh networking, there's a number of ways you can approach. We're focusing on telephony, which actually simplifies our problem to some degree. I think Village Telco found this as well, that there's a lot of things that you can do. If you're looking at narrowband voice, there's a number of things that are made a little easier. But also our focus on disaster response has greatly simplified what we can do by making a few assumptions about our availability to infrastructure and logistics and user skill levels and all of these sorts of things on the ground. So it makes some quite bold assumptions about that. Here's our assumption of available infrastructure. Essentially, you can't assume that there's any infrastructure at all. So this is a very easy assumption to make. And this is our assumption about logistical convenience. For it to work in a disaster, effectively, you may as well be on the moon. In Haiti, it was just simply impossible to get anything in there. So it needs to be something which can be built into the handsets and that kind of thing. And in terms of user skill level, someone's grandmother who has no interest in technology and probably lived 200 years ago. This is, I think, a good assumption to make about user skill. It needs to be entirely simple, and this is why we've put a bit of effort into having the ability to reuse existing phone numbers. And on that note, the flexibility in people acquiring new phone numbers in those situations simply isn't there. Phone numbers get set in stone at some point in the past, and people hopefully can remember them, or their phone remembers the phone numbers. There really isn't any scope in a disaster situation to tell people they now have a completely different phone number, and then they have to physically find the person they want to then be able to ring and say, oh look, here's my phone number, and now I'll run back away and I can call you. It's simply not an ideal situation. So there's this vacuum in which one has to assume that we're operating in a disaster situation. So, how do you structure an infrastructure that can work in that? Of course, it's going to end up being a mesh, because you have to assume that there's no supporting infrastructure, not even an access point. Wireless, yes, it's just unthinkable to try and string wires out. Self-assignment of numbers, again, there is no central authority available, and even if there was, can you imagine the delays of trying to get your number reallocated to you? So you have to be able to self-assign your number. But if you're doing that, you need some kind of authentication to be reasonably confident that the right person has the right number, so when you dial a number, you get to the right location. Bother. This is actually the hard part. And I've kind of hinted at it, and I will say it again, don't underestimate the value of being able to self-assign your own phone number, whether it's in a disaster or a remote community. If they can just self-assign whether it's real phone numbers that they might have when they're in town or just local phone numbers for that settlement, to be able to just set that up means that they have complete control over the network. They have formed a phone network that serves their purposes. With a little bit of forethought, you could allocate a bunch of VoIP tied in DID numbers and then use those locally and then have a backhaul to the global network.
Oh, may I ask a question? When you asked me to download a 5-digit number, when you showed me, hey, just how do you deal with the fact that at first place I thought, okay, then I take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because it's easy to remember. Probably other people are doing the same. How do you deal with people accidentally hitting the same numbers? Again.
So when you actually dial the number, there's a voice menu that says, do you want to connect to? And it will play a voice signature that the person recorded when they set the number. So when you first use the phone, whether you try and make a call or whether you actually specifically want to set your number, it will say, this is the first time you've used the system. Please, dial your number and press hash for the phone number you want, and then it records your voice. So anyone calling you the first time will get that voice signature played to them. And then basically, you press hash to connect. So if more than one person has claimed, you basically end up with a full interactive voice menu that says, press 1 to connect to and plays the voice, press 2 to connect to, and then you go, okay, this is who I want to talk to.
So you end up with several people being assigned to the same telephone number?
You can, which actually has some advantages in particular circumstances. Think if a local police force or emergency force wanted to provide services after a disaster, they could all claim 112 or 911 or 000, whatever the local service number is, or even a local police station number. And then, you could even get a little bit fancier there and say, okay, these people are all authorised to have that number, and you could do either a round robin or first to answer. There'd be a variety of options that you could explore.
And why did you not go the way to just the people ask for a number and then tell them the number?
So we're not quite...
Just allocation. You just enter and say, I want to have a number. You make that request and you get a response.
As in, the system chooses a number for you, you mean? There's no reason why you couldn't do that. But again, if in a disaster situation, you want people to be able to claim their existing phone number. You're absolutely right.
To claim their existing phone number.
That's right.
And you told me it's a minimum of 5 digits?
Yeah, that's just an arbitrary thing that we've set in the dial plan in most cases.
And if I dial more, is this
you can make it as long as you like.
So I can... That's... Okay, excellent.
Yeah. So this is actually what we've just talked about. So we capture the voice signature and we go through that whole process. And one of the things that we plan to add down the track is actually some public key infrastructure. So when you claim your phone number, it actually creates a subscriber ID entry, a little bit like the HLR on a GSM network. So there's this big ugly long number, which we will actually end up having as the public key, probably using elliptic curve cryptography, so that then transactions can be signed using that key. So it's quite fast to do the computation in quite short keys. So on the wireless mesh network, it will be quite traffic efficient. And then you can actually say, okay, I remember, I'm happy to verify for myself that that subscriber ID is that person with that phone number. And you can then set up, local networks of trust, or even in a larger sense, you could actually say, okay, maybe the local post office or some other authority can actually verify people's phone numbers, so you can cite some ID and maybe an existing phone bill and say, okay, with good confidence, this is the right number. But again, it doesn't need a